They sat there, Lisa and David, across from me in that cold, sterile hearing room. The air was thick with tension, but also something else. Something I could never have expected from my own daughter. Betrayal. Lisa's eyes darted nervously toward David as if seeking reassurance, while he exuded a smug confidence, the kind of arrogance that only people certain of their victory carry. I sat quietly, clutching the edge of the wooden table, trying to steady my breath. This was supposed to be family, but today it felt like a battlefield. 6 months ago, my husband, Thomas, passed away after a long illness. His departure left a silence in the house that I couldn't fill. But more than that, he left behind a legacy. A family business that had been in our blood for decades. Thomas had built it from the ground up, with sweat and grit, turning a small manufacturing company into a multimillion-dollar enterprise. I had been by his side through it all, managing the books, overseeing operations when he was away, and making decisions when illness forced him to rest. I thought I knew the business inside out, but apparently Lisa and David had other ideas. Lisa had always expected to take over the company once Thomas was gone. She and David had whispered about it often, under the guise of family dinners and casual visits. But now she was suing me, accusing me of mismanaging finances, claiming I was trying to cut them out of their rightful inheritance. The papers had arrived in the mail, cold and formal, turning my world upside down. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, reading through the legal complaint, my hands trembling as I realized my own daughter thought me incapable of running the company. I looked at them now, their faces hard and determined, and I felt a surge of both sadness and defiance. Lisa had always been the golden child. Smart, ambitious, and charming. David, her husband, was a sharp businessman, always calculating, always watching for an advantage. Together they made a formidable team, but I knew what they didn't. I was no helpless widow. I had been involved in every aspect of the business for years, often behind the scenes, quietly ensuring everything ran smoothly. Thomas had trusted me, and I had promised to protect what he built. The hearing room was silent except for the shuffling of papers and the occasional cough from the few spectators scattered in the back. Lisa's lawyer sat beside her, whispering updates and strategies. David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. I tried to recall the last time I had seen them like this. Before the lawsuits, the accusations, the Cold War that had settled over our family. Felt like a lifetime ago. As the judge called the hearing to order, I felt my heart pound against my ribs. This was no longer just about business. It was about trust, family, and the legacy Thomas had worked so hard to leave behind. I straightened my worn blazer, the one Thomas had always said made me look like a real executive, and prepared to fight, not just for the company but for my dignity. Lisa's voice was steady as she began to outline their grievances. She spoke of financial mismanagement, of decisions made without consultation, of an alleged lack of transparency, that in her eyes justified their lawsuit. But beneath the polished words I detected something else. A desperation to claim what they believed was theirs. I had watched her grow up, seen that same fierce determination in her eyes when she was a little girl. But today it felt like a weapon aimed directly at me. David chimed in with cold precision, listing figures and dates, painting a picture of chaos that, according to him, was my doing. I listened carefully, not interrupting, knowing that every word I held back would serve me better when it was my turn to speak. I had a lifetime of experience on my side, and I intended to use it. When the judge finally turned to me, I took a deep breath and began to speak. I recounted the years I had spent managing the company alongside Thomas, the long nights poring over financial reports, the strategic decisions made to keep the business afloat during tough times. I spoke of the challenges I faced after Thomas's passing, the grief, yes, but also the responsibility of steering a ship in stormy waters. I reminded the court that the business was not just an asset, it was a living legacy, one I was determined to protect. Lisa's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and disbelief as I spoke. I caught a fleeting glimpse of doubt in her expression, but David's steely gaze quickly masked it. Still, I knew that beneath their bravado, they were unprepared for the truth I was about to reveal. As the hearing continued, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was not just a legal battle, it was a test of who I was, and I was ready to prove that I was no mere widow lost in grief. Thomas had trusted me with everything, and I would not let his faith be betrayed by greed and false accusations. Throughout the proceedings, I noticed the judge observing me with a quiet intensity. There was something familiar in her eyes, a recognition that went beyond the formalities of the courtroom. I wondered if she sensed the depth of my resolve, or if she simply saw the truth behind the accusations. The tension in the room was palpable as the hearing drew to a close. Lisa and David exchanged glances, their confidence shaken but not broken. I gathered my belongings slowly, meeting their gazes without fear. This was only the beginning, but I was ready for the fight ahead. As I walked out of the hearing room and into the bright afternoon sun, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The path forward would not be easy, but I knew one thing for certain. I would protect Thomas's legacy with everything I had. They had underestimated me, and that was their first mistake. Lisa and David sat across from me, their confident postures barely masking the unease flickering beneath the surface. They thought they had me cornered, but what they didn't know was how deeply I understood the business, and how long I'd been quietly steering it alongside Thomas. They saw me as just a grieving widow, a woman out of her depth, but that was far from the truth. The courtroom was hushed, but my mind was alive with memories, years of experience flashing through my thoughts like a well-worn film reel. Lisa and David's accusations were nothing new. They were echoes of their own impatience and greed. They underestimated me because they never bothered to look beyond the surface. Judge Helen Monroe presided over the hearing with a calm authority that immediately put the room at ease. I noticed the subtle way she observed, the slight narrowing of her eyes when Lisa made her claims, as if she sensed there was more beneath the polished arguments. I had met Helen briefly years ago at a legal conference. She was sharp, fair, and not easily fooled. Her presence gave me a quiet reassurance. I thought back to a conversation with Thomas not long before his health declined. We sat in his study, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. He looked at me with that steady gaze I'd come to know so well and said, "Evelyn, you understand this business better than anyone else. I trust you to protect it when I'm gone." Those words had anchored me ever since. He knew the stakes and he believed in me. Now, as I sat in the courtroom, I realized that belief was what I needed to hold on to. Lisa and David were trying to rewrite the story, to cast me as an incompetent interloper. But I wasn't just Thomas's widow. I was his partner in every sense of the word. During a brief recess, I caught a glimpse of Lisa whispering to David, her expression torn. I wondered if any part of her remembered the years we had spent together. The late nights discussing quarterly reports, the strategy meetings where she had barely lifted a finger. Did she realize how much she had taken for granted? David's presence was different. Always calculated, always poised. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, and I knew he saw this lawsuit as a way to seize it all. But they hadn't accounted for my resilience, my knowledge, or my unwavering commitment. As the hearing resumed, Helen's questions became more probing. She asked about the company's financial health, about decision-making processes, and about the role I had played during Thomas's illness. I answered honestly, drawing on years of first-hand involvement. I could see the subtle shifts in the courtroom, the way some of Lisa's supporters exchanged uncertain glances, how the judge's pen hesitated over her notes. I shared details of the strategies Thomas and I had developed, plans to diversify our markets, investments we'd made to modernize operations, and the careful budgeting that had kept us afloat through economic downturns. I spoke of the countless hours I had devoted to understanding every facet of the business, often behind the scenes, making sure no detail was overlooked. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line as I spoke. I sensed her frustration, not just at being challenged, but at the truth she'd tried to deny. David, ever the strategist, tried to interject, but Helen gently reminded him to hold his comments for the proper time. The judge's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the undercurrents swirling in the room. Helen's questions weren't just procedural, they were a quiet search for the truth. I could tell she was weighing every word, every fact, and every nuance. A memory surfaced, Thomas and I sitting in the office late one night, going over the quarterly earnings report. He had looked tired but resolute, and I had promised him I would keep the company on course no matter what. That promise felt heavier than ever now, but I was determined to keep it. As the hearing drew on, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This was more than a legal dispute, it was a reckoning. Lisa and David had tried to paint me as a caretaker unfit for the role, but I was ready to prove them wrong. Outside the courtroom, the city buzzed with indifferent energy, but inside, every second felt charged with meaning. The stakes were high, not just for the company, but for the family's future. I could see the cracks beginning to form in Lisa and David's facade, subtle but unmistakable. Helen's gaze met mine briefly during a pause, a silent acknowledgement that this was no ordinary case. I nodded slightly, a quiet promise that I was prepared for whatever came next. The hearing ended for the day, and as I gathered my papers, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, but I had reminded everyone present, including myself, that I was not to be underestimated. Thomas's trust was my shield, and I intended to wield it with every ounce of strength I had. Walking out into the fading light, I resolved to dig deeper, to prepare for the challenges ahead. Lisa and David might have underestimated the widow, but they hadn't yet faced the woman who had quietly built the foundation of their family's legacy. The courtroom was thick with whispered conversations, but one caught my ear, David's voice low and urgent, barely more than a hiss. He leaned close to Lisa, speaking in tones meant only for her, his words weaving a web of doubt and suspicion. From across the room I caught the edge of his voice. "She's losing it, Lisa. Can't manage the books, forgets meetings. If we don't act now, everything will slip away." His eyes flicked toward me, calculating, cold. Lisa's face tightened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. She glanced at me, then back at David, caught between the loyalty to her husband's counsel and the lingering memories of a mother she once trusted. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the conflict between what she was being told and what she knew deep down. Their whispered campaign was more than just courtroom strategy, it was an attack on my very being. They weren't just questioning my management of the business. They were casting shadows over my sanity, my competence, my right to stand here at all. The sting of that betrayal cut deeper than any legal maneuver. For a moment I sat frozen, the weight of their falsehoods pressing down on me. But then a fire ignited inside, a fierce determination not to be silenced or diminished. I realized that if I stayed quiet they would win by default. Their lies would shape the story, and my voice would be lost beneath their deceit. I leaned forward, meeting Lisa's gaze directly. "Is this true?" I asked softly, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Do you believe these things about me?" The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Lisa's eyes flickered away, and I saw a brief flash of guilt, or perhaps regret. But David's hand subtly gripped her arm, pulling her back into the alliance they had formed against me. It was clear then. This was not just a legal battle. It was a war for the soul of our family. After the hearing I retreated to the quiet of my home, the walls echoing with memories of better times. I sat at the kitchen table, the legal complaint spread before me like a gauntlet thrown down. The allegations were severe. Negligence, fraud, mismanagement. Each word felt like a deliberate dagger aimed at my reputation. Later, in the privacy of a small cafe, I overheard a conversation between Lisa and David. They spoke in hushed tones, unaware that I was just beyond the partition. "If we can prove she's unstable," David said, "we take control of everything. The company, the assets, it all falls into our hands." Lisa's voice was quieter, tinged with doubt. "But what about Mom? This feels wrong." David's reply was cold, dismissive. "We're doing what's necessary. She's lost the plot and the business is at risk. We're protecting our future." Their plan was clear. Paint me as unstable, strip me of control, and claim the fortune they believed was theirs by right. But they hadn't counted on one thing. I was ready. I returned home, rolling up my sleeves, ready to fight back. The years I'd spent managing the company, the late nights poring over financial statements, the intimate knowledge of every contract and partnership, I would use every piece of that experience to unravel their lies. I began gathering documents, emails, and records, building a fortress of evidence to defend myself. I reached out to old colleagues and trusted advisors, seeking their support and testimonies. I knew the battle ahead would be grueling, but I was no stranger to hard work. The courtroom had become a stage for their deception, but I was determined to turn it into a place where truth would prevail. I was no longer the silent widow. I was a woman reclaiming her power, ready to expose the whispered lies that threatened to destroy everything. As night fell, I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I would not let them define my story. I would rise above their deceit and prove that strength and resilience run deeper than bloodlines and betrayal. The legal complaint arrived on a gray, drizzly morning, the envelope cold and impersonal in my hands. I sat at the kitchen table, the document spread out before me like a challenge written in stark, unforgiving words. Negligence, fraud, mismanagement. Each allegation was a deliberate attempt to erode everything I had built alongside Thomas. I read and reread the pages, the formal language feeling like a blade twisting inside my chest. But beneath the shock, a quiet resolve began to take hold. Lisa and David had painted a picture of me as reckless and unfit, accusing me of decisions that threatened the company's very survival. Their words were meant to shake my confidence, to make me question my own competence. But I knew the truth. Every figure, every contract, every strategic choice had been carefully considered and meticulously documented. I wasn't about to let their deceit go unanswered. Later that day, I found myself sitting across from Lisa and David in a small conference room, the air thick with tension. They spoke candidly, their voices low but edged with determination. "We have to show the court that Mom is unstable," David said bluntly, his eyes cold and calculating. "If she's declared incompetent, we take control. The business, the assets, it all falls into place." Lisa's expression was conflicted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "I don't like it," she admitted softly. "But if she's really making mistakes, if the company is at risk, we have to act." David's gaze hardened. "She's not thinking straight. This is about protecting our future." Their plan was clear. Discredit me, seize control, and rewrite the family's story in their favor. They believed they could paint me as a vulnerable widow, incapable of managing the complexity of the business. What they didn't realize was that I had anticipated this move, and I was prepared. That evening I sat at my desk, surrounded by stacks of financial reports, correspondence, and legal documents. I began piecing together a comprehensive defense, cataloging every decision I had made and every safeguard I had put in place. I reached out to trusted colleagues, some of whom had worked alongside Thomas and me for years, asking them to review the records and prepare statements attesting to my competence and dedication. I remembered the countless nights Thomas and I spent discussing the company's future, the strategic pivots we planned to weather economic storms, and the careful budgeting that had kept us afloat. He had trusted me implicitly, and I intended to honor that trust by standing firm. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, consultations with financial experts, and late-night sessions reviewing documents. It was exhausting, but I welcomed the challenge. Every piece of evidence I gathered was a brick in the wall. I was building to protect the legacy Thomas had left me. Meanwhile, I observed Lisa and David's strategy unfolding in the courtroom. Their attorney relentlessly questioned my decisions, attempting to portray me as careless and overwhelmed. But I remained composed, listening carefully and preparing my responses. I knew that the truth was my strongest weapon. One afternoon, as I reviewed a series of financial statements, I noticed an inconsistency in one of the reports David had presented. It was subtle but significant, a misrepresented figure that cast doubt on his credibility. I shared this discovery with my legal team, knowing it could shift the momentum in my favor. I also began to consider the emotional toll this battle was taking on Lisa. There were moments when her resolve wavered, when I glimpsed the daughter I once knew, the girl who had sat on my lap, who had celebrated birthdays and graduations with genuine joy. But David's influence seemed to harden her, binding her to a course that threatened to destroy not just our business but our family. Determined to address the root of the conflict, I contemplated reaching out to Lisa privately, hoping to bridge the growing chasm between us. But I knew that before any reconciliation could happen, I had to secure my position and expose the truth behind their accusations. As the hearing date approached, I prepared meticulously, rehearsing my statements and organizing the evidence I intended to present. I reminded myself that this was more than a legal dispute. It was a fight for justice, for honor, and for the future of a company built on decades of hard work. In the quiet moments before the next court session, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The grief of losing Thomas was still fresh, but it was tempered by a fierce determination to protect what he had entrusted to me. They thought they could weaken me with lies and manipulation, but I was ready to stand tall. The coming days would test every ounce of my strength and resolve, but I was prepared. I was not just defending a business, I was defending my dignity, my family, and the promise I had made to Thomas. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to face them head-on. The courtroom felt colder that morning, the sterile walls echoing with whispered accusations and the shuffle of papers. I sat quietly, my fingers tightening around the armrest of my chair, as Lisa's lawyer launched into his opening statement. He painted a picture of confusion and vulnerability, a fragile widow overwhelmed by grief, incapable of managing the sprawling business empire left in her care. His words were sharp, designed to undermine every ounce of confidence I had worked so hard to build. I listened carefully, the familiar sting of betrayal sharpening my resolve. This was the moment I had prepared for. The moment to rise above their assumptions and reveal the truth they so desperately tried to hide. When the lawyer finished, the room buzzed softly with anticipation, eyes flicking toward me, waiting to see how I would respond. Taking a deep breath, I rose slowly, my voice steady as I addressed the courtroom. I understand the concerns raised, but I assure you, they are based on misunderstandings and misrepresentations. I paused, allowing my words to settle. I have managed this company for years alongside my late husband. The decisions I have made were deliberate, informed, and always in the company's best interest. Eyes shifted, some skeptical, others curious. I continued, detailing the strategic choices I had overseen. Investments in new technology, renegotiations of contracts, and expansions into emerging markets. Each point was backed by documents I carefully presented, evidence that spoke louder than accusations. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I turned toward David, whose smug expression faltered for the briefest instant. During the last hearing, I noticed inconsistencies in the financial reports presented by Mr. Thompson, I said, using his formal name deliberately. These discrepancies raised serious questions about the credibility of the claims against me. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. David shifted uneasily in his seat, his confident facade cracking. Lisa's eyes widened, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. I held their gazes unwavering, as I laid out the evidence, emails, financial statements, and expert analyses that contradicted their narrative. The judge leaned forward, her keen eyes scanning the documents. I saw the subtle acknowledgement in her expression, a sign that the tide was shifting. The courtroom atmosphere changed. The air grew charged with the weight of truth. As I spoke, I felt a quiet strength envelop me. This was more than just a defense, it was a reclaiming of my story, a challenge to the falsehoods that had threatened to define me. I wasn't just a grieving widow. I was a capable leader, a protector of a legacy built on decades of hard work. Lisa's lawyer attempted to counter, questioning my decisions and suggesting lapses in judgment. But I met each challenge with calm clarity, drawing on my years of experience and the evidence meticulously gathered. I could see the doubt creeping into the faces of their supporters. At one point, I addressed the court directly about the whispered accusations I had overheard, the attempts to portray me as unstable and incapable. These are not just unfounded rumors, I said firmly. They are deliberate tactics meant to undermine my reputation and seize control of the company. Lisa's face flushed and David's jaw tightened. The courtroom was silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. I knew I had struck a nerve. As the day wore on, I presented testimonies from trusted colleagues who spoke to my competence and dedication. Their voices added depth to my defense, painting a picture of a woman deeply involved in every facet of the business. Throughout the proceedings, I caught glimpses of Lisa's inner conflict. There were moments when her eyes softened, as if recalling a bond long strained but not entirely broken. Yet David's presence remained a constant, his influence steering the narrative away from reconciliation. When the judge finally called a recess, I gathered my papers slowly, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph. I had faced their accusations head-on, armed with truth and unshakable resolve. Outside the courtroom, the world seemed oblivious to the battle unfolding within those walls. But inside, I had shifted the momentum. I had shown that beneath the grief and the accusations lay a woman ready to defend her legacy with unwavering strength. As I stepped into the sunlight, I knew the fight was far from over. But I had made one thing clear. I would not be silenced and I would not be defeated. The next chapter of this story was mine to write. Lisa's confident front began to crack in the courtroom's tense atmosphere. I caught it in the way her fingers trembled slightly when she reached for her glass of water, the hesitation in her voice when she answered a question about the company's recent financials. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A fissure in the facade she and David had so carefully constructed. David, ever the strategist, tried to rally her with a sharp glance, but the damage was done. The united front they had presented was starting to unravel, revealing the fractures beneath their alliance. I watched silently, knowing that this was a pivotal moment, not just for the case, but for the fragile bonds of our family. During a brief recess, I saw Lisa standing alone in the hallway, her shoulders slumped, eyes distant. I approached cautiously, the years of motherhood and love compelling me to reach out despite the wounds between us. "Lisa," I began softly, "this doesn't have to tear us apart." She looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Mom, you don't understand," she whispered, voice cracking. "David says you're putting the company at risk. That you're unstable." Her words hit me like a blow. The woman I had raised, the daughter I had nurtured, was caught between loyalty to her husband and the truth she feared to see. I reached out, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "I'm fighting not just for the company but for all of us. For our family's future." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, it felt like the old bond might be mended. But the courtroom called us back, and the fragile moment dissolved. Back inside, I presented the financial documents I had painstakingly gathered, records showing steady growth, careful budgeting, and strategic investments that countered the narrative of mismanagement. I introduced a secretly recorded conversation, a tape where David candidly discussed plans to declare me incompetent and seize control. The courtroom gasped as the recording played, the truth laid bare in David's own voice. The judge's expression tightened, and I could feel the weight of revelation settling over the room. Lisa's face paled, her eyes flickering between disbelief and dawning realization. David's confident posture faltered, the mask slipping to reveal the greed and manipulation beneath. As the evidence mounted, the tide turned unmistakably in my favor. The lawyer's attacks lost their bite, and the courtroom's sympathy shifted toward my side. The very deceit meant to dismantle me had become the foundation of my defense. Throughout it all, I remained composed, knowing that each piece of truth brought me closer to justice. But beneath the surface, I felt a complex swirl of emotions: sorrow for the family we had become, anger at the betrayal, and a cautious hope that healing might still be possible. The hearing ended with a quiet murmur of conversations, the judge signaling a recess to consider the new evidence. As I gathered my things, I glanced at Lisa, who avoided my gaze, her expression a mixture of regret and confusion. Outside the courtroom, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the city. I breathed deeply, the fight far from over but the path ahead clearer. The truth was no longer hidden, and with it came the possibility of redemption, not just for me but for the family we still had the chance to rebuild. Judge Monroe's gavel came down with a steady final thud, echoing through the packed courtroom. The tension that had gripped the room for weeks finally lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of resolution. She looked directly at me, her eyes clear and unwavering. "After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, this court finds Mrs. Carter fully competent to manage the affairs of the family business. The allegations against her are without merit and seem motivated by personal gain rather than concern for the company's welfare." A collective breath seemed to release from the crowd: relief, disbelief, perhaps a touch of respect. Lisa's eyes welled with tears as she sank back into her chair, the weight of the ruling settling on her shoulders. David's face was a mask of defeat, the confidence drained from his posture. I sat quietly, absorbing the moment. Years of doubt, accusations, and strained family ties had led to this point. The judge's words were more than just a legal victory. They were a validation of everything Thomas had believed in, everything I had fought for. After the trial, the atmosphere was fragile but hopeful. Lisa approached me hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't see things clearly. I let fear and other things cloud my judgment." I nodded, understanding that forgiveness would not come overnight. It's going to take time, Lisa. But we can start by being honest with each other. We spoke then, not as adversaries but as mother and daughter, acknowledging the pain and the misunderstandings that had driven us apart. It was the beginning of a long, uncertain journey toward healing. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself back into the business with renewed vigor. The company was more than a legacy. It was a living testament to Thomas's vision and our family's resilience. I met with managers, reviewed strategies, and set new goals, always mindful of the delicate balance between preserving tradition and embracing innovation. The experience had changed me. I was no longer the quiet partner behind the scenes but a leader confident in her own right. The battle had revealed strengths I hadn't fully recognized before, and I was determined to honor Thomas's memory by guiding the company with integrity and purpose. Though the scars of the legal battle remained, so did the hope for a restored family. I knew rebuilding trust with Lisa and even David would require patience, openness, and time. But I was ready for that challenge. One morning, as I stood by the window of my office overlooking the city skyline, I felt a deep sense of peace. The fight had tested me, but it had also shown me who I truly was. A woman who had faced adversity head-on and emerged stronger. Thomas's legacy was safe, not just because of legal rulings, but because it was carried forward by love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family. If you loved the story, like the video and subscribe.